What's going on, everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the all-new Beelink GTI11 Mini PC. Now this is coming out of their GTI line, and personally I am a big fan of the cases they use for these. We've actually taken a look at a 3rd gen Ryzen powered version of this, but this one here happens to have a Tiger Lake Intel i5 CPU. So like I mentioned, I've always loved the case design that Beelink has been using on their GTI line. We do have plenty of I/O when it comes to these mini PCs. And this one here should give us some pretty decent performance for what it's packing. So inside of the box, you're obviously going to receive the mini PC itself. We also get a 65 watt power supply, a 6-foot HDMI cable, VESA bracket, and some extra hardware. Up front here, we have 2 USB 3.1 ports, a 3.5mm audio jack, USB Type-C. This is full function, but unfortunately it's not Thunderbolt. That would have been really awesome for this little PC. And on top of the unit, they've also included a fingerprint sensor. Around back here, we've got our power input, dual gigabit Ethernet, full-size HDMI, full-size DisplayPort, 2 more USB 3.1 ports, and 2 USB 2.0 ports. When it comes to the specs of the new GTI11 from Beelink, for that CPU, we have the Intel Tiger Lake i5 1135G7. We've got 4 cores, 8 threads, base clock of 2.4 GHz, with a boost up to 4.2. As for the graphics, this does have the built-in Intel Iris Xe at 1.3 GHz, but since we have that 1135G7, we only get 80 execution units as opposed to 96 with the i7 version. This does come with 16 GB of DDR4 running at 3200 MHz, and their new claim to fame on their GTI series is they're using brand name RAM and storage. So for the RAM in this, it's actually using Crucial. It's running in dual channel. We also get a 512GB M.2 SSD made by Kingston, and this came with Windows 10 pre-installed, but you could always install Windows 11 or Linux. Basically anything that supports an x86 CPU should run on this unit. Real quick, I wanted to pull the bottom off so we could take a look in here, and this does support a 2.5-inch drive. I would highly recommend using the SSD. We've also got that Crucial RAM, so this is running in dual channel. It's SODIMM at 3200 MHz, a Kingston A2000 M.2 SSD, plus we have another slot in here, so when it comes down to it, you could add a ton of storage to this little thing. So instead of busting out my big monitor, I figured I'd use this little portable dealio here. This is 4K. As you can see, we have that 1135, we've also got 16 GB of 3200 MHz RAM, and those Intel Iris Xe graphics. So if you wanted to use something like this as an everyday desktop for web browsing, email checking, some light video and photo editing, it's going to work out just fine. We do have plenty of power here. It's also got Wi-Fi 6 built in. But the first thing I wanted to test here was a little bit of 4K video playback from YouTube. And with 4K video playback, I always like to turn scaling off, just so we have a true 4K setup here. And we'll just go with a 4K 60 FPS video. I know it's a bit hard to see stats for nerds up there because we do have scaling turned all the way down with Windows and we're at 4K, but I will zoom in a second. Overall, the 1135G7 should be able to handle 4K video playback really well from basically any source. So I just let this play through for a little while, and as you can see, our viewpoint is at 4K, our current optimal res is 4K, and we've only dropped 2 frames. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to 4K video playback from the 1135G7, I've always had really good luck, so 4K shouldn't be an issue. So one thing that I've noticed is this CPU is actually running at 28 watts right out of the box, but in the BIOS we can actually up this, and I've taken it up to 60 watts. I would definitely not recommend this, but I wanted to see if it would actually handle it or even do it from the BIOS. And with Prime 95 running, over here with Core Temp, you can see it jumps up to around 56 to 57 watts. I'm not going to recommend running this at 60 watts because after all, you will run into some cooling issues. But what I've done is actually set this up at 35 watts and it seems to be really good across the board. Moving over to some benchmarks. First up, we have Geekbench 5. Single core is looking really good, and it always does with these 1135G7s, especially at a higher TDP than 15 watts. We got 1371 on single and 5062 on multi. Keep in mind, we've only got 4 cores and 8 threads with this. It's still looking really good for a mobile chip. Next up for the benchmarks, we have 3D Mark Wildlife with a total score of 9,647. And this does have sufficient cooling to keep those higher CPU clocks and GPU clocks at 35 watts. I didn't see any thermal throttling while gaming or running these benchmarks at 35. And the final benchmark here is 3D Mark Night Raid with a total score of 14,785. So yeah, this has fallen right in line with the other 1135 G7 PCs that I've tested in the past. We are getting a bit higher than some of the laptops that we've tested, but we do have much better cooling and we're able to take that TDP up. But now I think it's time to move over to some PC gaming and see how this little thing performs. We have Halo 3 1080p in performance mode, and we can get a constant 60 out of this. I did lock the VSync on because when it was unlocked, it would just kind of overrun that GPU and dip down below 60, but with VSync on, as you can see, we're getting some steady frame rates out of this thing. Street Fighter 5 medium settings, 900p, we're getting a steady 60 out of it. Now I have seen it dip down to around 59 when there was a lot of effects on screen, but if I didn't have that frame counter on, I would have never noticed it. Fortnite performance mode, medium settings, we got an average of 91 FPS out of this game. I was actually really impressed to see it running this well. Moving over to Genshin Impact, and the way I have this one set up right now is 900p, medium settings. It's running great at 60 FPS. Now from the settings, we can always go down to 30 FPS high with this setup, and it's going to run at 30 all day. But at high, 1080p with that 60 FPS unlocked, I got an average of 53 FPS. So we're not quite at a constant 60 1080p high, and that's why I took it down to 900p medium. So I was really hoping to get a little better performance out of Forza Horizon 5. 900p low settings, I got an average of 58 FPS. I mean, right there on the edge. This is also set up with resolution scaling set to performance. Now, if you go to the lowest settings, this actually does a really good job. I got an average of 78 FPS, but I really can't deal with the lowest settings on this. There's just a lot of pop in. It does take a lot away from this game. And the final PC game I tested here was GTA 5. I've said it before in other videos on the 1135 G7, it's just not a chip cut out for this game here. Now with driver updates it has gotten a bit better, but I only got an average of 57 FPS, 900p normal settings on this PC. With these little PCs, I also like to take a look at total system power consumption from the wall. This is always plugged into a kilowatt meter. At idle, we average 11 watts. 4K video playback, it jumps up to around 14 to 15 watts. Average gaming, it pulls 46 watts, but remember, I do have that TDP set at 35. And the maximum that I could get this to pull from the wall while maxing out all 4 cores, 8 threads, and those built-in Iris Xe graphics was 68 watts. So overall, for a mini PC powered by the 1135 G7, it's definitely doing a great job. And in this video, you didn't see any emulation. If you're interested in checking out the emulation performance on this chip here, I've done several videos. I'll leave a link in the description. I highly recommend checking this video out here, and that's because we can match the TDP that little board did with this Beelink unit, and we're going to get the same performance. We actually might get better cooling with the Beelink because it does have a much larger cooler. But overall, when it comes to emulation on the 1135 G7, at those higher TDPs, this will even do Wii U Breath of the Wild at 30 FPS, and it also does an amazing job with PS3 emulation and basically everything in between. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. It's just a quick look at the new Beelink GT11i. If you're in the market for a Tiger Lake Mini PC, this is definitely one that I can recommend. We do have more upgradability to this as for adding storage and more RAM than we do with some of the other ones, but it is lacking Thunderbolt 4 support, so if you were interested in connecting an eGPU to this, it's just not going to do it, and I really do wish they would have added it. If you have any questions or you want to see anything else running on this, let me know in the comments below, and like always, thanks for watching.